December 7, 1941. Approximately 215 nautical miles west of Oahu, on the flight deck of USS Enterprise, CV-6, the salt tasted like iron and the morning horizon was a thin, pale slash between dark water and colder sky. The carrier rode a slow rolling swell. Steel cables hummed. The wooden deck steamed where men stamped their boots, and the smell of avgas and hot oil wove through the crew like a second uniform. Flight crews, gray-faced, clipped, bone-tired from long transits, moved with the precise, anxious choreography of men accustomed to the thin line between launch and catastrophe. Captain George D. Murray stood on the starboard island in a heavy canvas overcoat, collar turned up against wind that cut like a file. He was a compact man with the hard jaw of a career naval officer. His eyes were on the horizon and on his air group, not on the dispatches in his hand. Around him, signalmen snapped flags, petty officers barked orders, and the KG's radio man keyed long, urgent transmissions. The ship's radar, one of the early RCACX AMSETs, gave its blind, grainy whisper of the sky ahead. Most of the fleet still trusted eyes more than instruments, but Enterprise's radar had been a comfort to some and an annoyance to others. For the men there, the ocean at dawn felt like being between breaths. At 06:00, Enterprise's scout planes were already in the air, 17 Douglas SBD Dauntless scout bombers, the KG's aircraft, the backbone of the carrier's scouting and dive capability, rose in pairs into a low-gray sky. The pilots were young, their voices edged with the nervous humor that only aviators find in the face of routine risk. Lieutenant J.G. pilots checked fuel, thumbed engine mixtures, felt for the reassuring thump of the right cyclones. Over the radios came the soft, steady commands from the control officer. Victor 6, you are cleared for your assigned search arc, northeast to southeast. Report any contacts. Maintain fuel states. Across the vastness of that morning, a different choreography was being set in motion. Hundreds of miles to the northwest, carriers of Japan's Kido Butai steamed under Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's flag. 6 flat tops strung like black teeth across a blue sea. In the months before, voices within the Imperial Japanese Navy, proud, confident, schooled in decisive surface engagements, had begun to smirk at the idea of the American carrier as the decisive weapon in a Pacific war. For some senior officers, battleships still glittered with prestige. Aircraft carriers, with their thin armored decks and exposed hangars, were unproven in the kind of fleet duel they believed a global war would demand. That contempt had hardened into overconfidence when Pearl Harbor's battleships would become targets. The men on Enterprise could not know what decisions were being made far to the west. They could only feel like a tide underfoot, the sense of a world tilting. At 7:50 local time, word crackled across Enterprise's CIC. Pearl Harbor was under attack. The radio messages arrived fragmented, panicked, and then crystalline. This is Pearl Harbor. We are under attack by aircraft. The SBD searchers, still out on their assigned arcs, were suddenly between two radio worlds, one the calm language of training, the other the jagged grammar of emergency. As they converged toward Oahu, a handful of those Dauntlesses sighted Japanese formations already over the harbor, the sky filled with the rumble of engines and the staccato flame of guns. From the carrier 100 miles away, those small, thin planes became witnesses to a drama playing out 2 decks below a different horizon. Dive brakes locked, slipstreams roaring, pilots watching Pearl Harbor go from blue to smoke. Enterprise's aviators lost aircraft that morning. 7 SBDs did not return, either felled by enemy fire or, worse, by the frantic anti-aircraft barrages that had not been told friendly planes might be returning from sea. Names were taken down on postcards that day. Young pilots whose mothers would get telegrams, petty officers who had laughed in forecastle messes at the shape of a war none had expected. The carrier's deck crew watched the warlight on the horizon and felt the distance between being engaged and being safe evaporate in an instant. By evening, Enterprise had received more than reports. She had received orders. Misleading intelligence, confusion, and the basic chaos of war produced an erroneous radio mention of a Japanese carrier reported southwest of the Enterprise's position. Around 17 was under a bruised sky, Captain Murray ordered a strike. 6 Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters of VF-6, 18 Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers from VT-6, and 6 SBDs from VB-6 roared off the flight deck, an awkward armada for a dusk mission, light on fighters and heavy on machines barely fit for a decisive air duel. The airstrike found no targets. Torpedo squadrons searched empty seas. Dive squadrons circled like hawks over blue nothing. When the Wildcats were diverted to Hickam Field on Oahu, they arrived to an island already tense and alive with smoke and anti-aircraft fire. Panic had set eyes and nerves on edge. 3 Wildcats were tragically downed that night by friendly guns. Enterprise's men learned in rapid, cruel lessons that identification in warfare was fragile. On the evening of December 8th, after steaming the long prow back toward Oahu, Enterprise eased into Pearl Harbor for fuel and supplies. Vice Admiral William Bull Halsey, Jr., then commander of Carrier Division 2, moved through the hangars and on deck like a man who could not sleep, ordering every able-bodied hand to rearm and refuel. What normally took 24 hours was done in 7, ordnance crews sweating under arc lights, aviators hunched over checklist after checklist, and the carrier, already a machine of war, transforming itself into something else. A statement that the United States was not finished, not broken. Out on the horizon, the Japanese flag still flew above a fleet that had struck a bitter blow at battleships and shore facilities. In officers' messes and naval clubs back in Tokyo, there was talk. Too much. Arrogant talk. That the U.S. fleet was crippled. That carriers were a curious American experiment that could be outclassed by a navy with better seamanship and a taste for decisive blows. But aboard Enterprise, under Captain Murray's steady, watchful eye, men prepared their engines, their planes, their ammunition belts, and kept a steady, stubborn faith in a battered, seaworthy ship that would not be docked by a single morning's shock. The stage was set, the war had changed, and already a few steelmen aboard a single carrier had begun to write the counter-argument. December 10, 1941, North Pacific waters just west of Hawaii. The sea rolled dark and endless beneath the keel of USS Enterprise. On her bridge, Admiral William Bull Halsey, Jr. leaned over a chart table under red lights, his jaw set in a line of fury and purpose. Around him, officers murmured reports, intelligence chatter from broken radio signals, spotty reconnaissance photos, half-legible Morse traffic from submarines shadowing Japanese ships somewhere beyond the horizon. Halsey's eyes were fixed on one idea: strike back fast, hard, and often. Get me the air group ready by dawn. He barked, his voice carrying through the steel-walled command center. We'll remind them what's still afloat in the Pacific. By dawn, Enterprise's deck was alive. Cruz in khaki and denim moved like gears in a great living machine, arming bombs, checking torpedoes, fueling aircraft. The metallic tang of fuel mixed with the sour-sweet stench of cordite. Below deck, ordnance men worked bare-chested in the heat, sweat cutting clean lines through grease as they hauled 1,000-pound bombs into elevators. The dauntless dive bombers gleamed under the morning sun, their fuselages marked with the bold black numbers of Air Group 6. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, the CAG, calm-eyed, broad-shouldered, a flyer's flyer, climbed into his SPD's cockpit and glanced down the deck. The carrier's flight deck crew gave him the thumbs up. Over the radio came the clipped electric voice of the flight controller. Launch the strike group, Godspeed. Engines roared to life. The deck vibrated. One by one, the Dauntlesses clawed into the gray sky, followed by the Devastator torpedo bombers, their rotund bellies heavy with ordnance. The Enterprise Air Group was heading to support Wake Island, a tiny coral atoll still holding out against relentless Japanese assaults. The Japanese Navy, riding high after Pearl Harbor, was pressing everywhere. Guam, Wake, the Philippines, Malaya. Yet in those early days, Japan's high command barely registered the name Enterprise. She had been out at sea during the attack and thus, to them, a ghost ship, an irrelevant detail in the grand victory narrative. Some of the senior staff officers in Tokyo's naval circles even joked about her. A single carrier cannot win a war, one admiral scoffed over sake. She'll be sunk as soon as she's found. But Enterprise was not about to hide. As the air group approached Wake, they hit scattered squalls and a horizon stitched with smoke. Japanese bombers were already pounding the island. Enterprise's SBDs dove from altitude 9,000 feet through broken cloud. The first Dauntless dropped from the sun, flaps out, dive brakes screaming, the ocean spiraling up to meet them. Bombs fell clean and true. Plumes erupted among the Japanese invasion force, scattering landing craft and fuel barges. Devastators swept low, torpedoes streaking beneath the waves. Radio chatter filled the sky. Target hit. Target burning. Watch your 6. Zero's coming in hot. Break right! Break right. Lieutenant Swede Veitasa, one of the Enterprise's hotshot pilots, pulled his Wildcat into a climbing turn and engaged two A6M Zeros head-on. The Wildcat, slower but tougher, took rounds across the fuselage, but Veitasa stayed on the trigger. One Zero burst into flame. The other peeled away, trailing smoke. By the time the strike group regrouped, the Japanese assault on Wake had faltered. At least for a few days. Back aboard the Enterprise, the returning aircraft looked like ghosts themselves. Bullet holes patched with tape, wings chipped, crews pale and trembling. Halsey watched from the island bridge as the last plane trapped on deck. He said nothing for a long time, then simply muttered, "That'll do." The Enterprise steamed east again. Days later, she would rendezvous with Yorktown and Lexington, 3 carriers against an empire that had already sunk or crippled every battleship at Pearl Harbor. The United States had no illusions left. The age of the battleship was over. Carriers would decide this war, and Enterprise was to be its relentless spearhead. In Tokyo, as reports trickled in of American carrier raids on the Marshall and Gilbert Islands, the tone among the admirals shifted. The name Enterprise began appearing in intelligence briefings circled in red ink. "This ship," one officer complained in early 1942, "keeps showing up where we least expect her." By the spring of 1942, the Big E, as her crew affectionately called her, was striking again and again across the Central Pacific, Kwajalein, Wocha, Maloelap. Every time she appeared, Japanese commanders were forced to react. In one intercepted message, a Japanese staff officer reportedly remarked, "If the Americans have more ships like Enterprise, we may find the tide less favorable than we thought." But for now, Japan still held the initiative. Its navy, vast and well-drilled, remained supreme. Enterprise's raids were pinpricks, not hammer blows. Yet among her crew, a quiet conviction grew. They had survived Pearl Harbor. They had drawn blood. And somewhere beyond the rolling horizon, a decisive battle was coming, one that would decide who truly ruled the Pacific sky. May 30th, 1942. Pacific Ocean, 1,000 nautical miles southwest of Hawaii. The USS Enterprise churned through waters as dark and restless as molten steel. On the bridge, Captain George D. Murray's gaze followed the waves, but it was the skies beyond that drew the eyes of the airmen and sailors alike. The carrier's decks hummed with activity. Aviators checked instruments, adjusted throttle linkages, and whispered prayers into open cockpits. Every bolt, every control lever, every rotating turret was inspected with painstaking care, for the battle looming would not forgive a single flaw. Below deck, cryptographers in the ship's intelligence center hunched over maps and charts, cross-referencing decoded Japanese communications. Midway was the prize, and American codebreakers had confirmed what Admiral Chester W. Nimitz already suspected. The Imperial Navy planned a decisive blow, an invasion that would lure U.S. carriers into a trap. The Japanese believed their advance was unstoppable, that the Americans would stumble like moths toward the light of their superior fleet. Japanese admirals, still buoyed by the triumph at Pearl Harbor, had openly mocked the notion that carriers alone could challenge the striking power of the Kido Butai. But Enterprise's crew had learned differently. Over the months, the Big E had danced through raids and strikes, surviving encounters with superior forces, dodging torpedoes, and emerging from under fire with decks scorched, but morale unbroken. The lessons of Wake, the Marshalls, and the Gilbert Islands had shaped them into a deadly, precise machine of war. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey moved through the hangar deck, clipboard in hand, addressing pilots by name. "Lieutenant McCluskey," a young ensign asked, "do we really stand a chance?" "We do," McCluskey replied without hesitation, his eyes scanning the line of dive bombers. "We have the ship, the men, and the planes. And we have a plan they don't know we have. That counts for more than firepower." Even so, tension was palpable. The Enterprise crew knew that this would be no mere skirmish. The Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, were seasoned, their pilots some of the finest in the world. Japanese admirals still dismissed U.S. carrier capability, assuming the Americans had been lucky at previous raids. That arrogance, however, had blinded them to a reality that the Enterprise's crew had already internalized. The flexibility, speed, and resilience of a carrier could overturn even the most carefully laid plans. By June 3rd, Enterprise had joined the U.S. carrier task force with Yorktown and Hornet. Aboard, Admiral Raymond Spruance, poised and calculating, reviewed intelligence reports and reconnaissance photos, tracing every potential position of the Japanese fleet. He turned to Halsey, who had been observing from the island bridge with a cigarette clamped between his teeth. "They think we won't be ready," Spruance said. "Let's make sure they're right until the moment they aren't." The reconnaissance planes launched at dawn, cutting through clouds like streaks of silver. Enterprise's SBD Dauntlesses scoured the ocean, spotting smoke trails from Japanese destroyers and the occasional aircraft patrol. Each sighting was relayed to the task force in precise clipped Morse code. The tension on the Enterprise was thick. Crewmen moved in near silence, mechanics with hands blackened by grease and oil, pilots checking flares, bombs, and radios. Every man knew this was the calm before the storm. In Tokyo, Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, confident and proud, reviewed his own maps. He assumed, as many Japanese commanders did, that U.S. carriers were scattered and unprepared. "They will not dare face our main force," he declared to his staff, laughter mingling with cigarette smoke. They did not anticipate that the Enterprise, with her air group ready, was sailing straight into their trap, not as prey, but as a spearhead for a counterstrike that would shock the Pacific theater. On June 4th, dawn broke over the horizon in a streak of pale gold and violet. The Enterprise's flight deck was alive again, engines warming, propellers spinning. Halsey walked among the deck crews, nodding at ordnance men and pilots alike. The ship seemed to pulse beneath their feet, a living entity aware that every motion, every launch, every flight would carry consequences for thousands of men across thousands of miles of ocean. Then, just after 06 Gaum, the first Japanese planes were sighted. Enterprise's Wildcats scrambled, their engines screaming, chasing A6M0 fighters across the sky. Dive bombers lifted from the flight deck, their noses pointed downward, dive brakes locked. The Enterprise was no longer just a ship. She was the pivot of a counterstrike that Japanese admirals had mocked only months earlier. McCluskey, in his Dauntless, felt the adrenaline surge as he dove toward a Japanese carrier. Smoke plumes and anti-aircraft fire lit the ocean below. Every calculation, every maneuver, every split-second decision would define the outcome of a battle that would be remembered for generations. The Enterprise was about to become the nightmare Japan never anticipated, an American carrier that could strike decisively, survive, and change the tide of the war. June 4, 1942. Midway Atoll, Central Pacific, 10:22 a.m. The sky was a cauldron of flame and smoke. Below, the blue Pacific flashed white where bombs met steel. Above, the scream of engines tore through the clouds. The USS Enterprise's air group, scouting Squadron 6 and bombing Squadron 6, had just found the heart of the Japanese carrier force. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey gripped his control stick as his Dauntless dove from 18,000 feet. Wind roared past the canopy. The altimeter needle spun madly. Below him, the Japanese carrier Kaga was a moving scar of sunlight and shadow, its deck swarming with aircraft being refueled and rearmed, bombs and torpedoes scattered across the planks like death waiting to ignite. "Dive brakes out," McCluskey shouted into his headset. His squadron followed, the sky above suddenly peppered with falling dots, the descending Dauntlesses, each one bearing a 1,000-pound bomb. The anti-aircraft guns below erupted, black blossoms of flak bursting around the attackers. One shell tore past McCluskey's wingtip, close enough to rattle his bones. He lined up the carrier's center line in his sight. The world narrowed to that single strip of wood and fire. At 1,500 feet, he toggled the bomb release. The Dauntless jolted upward as the ordnance dropped. Seconds later, the deck of the Kaga vanished in a geyser of flame. The blast tore through planes, fuel lines, and bombs, sending fire climbing up the carrier's island like a living thing. "Direct hit. Kaga burning," came the call over the radio. Moments later, another group of Enterprise dive bombers found the Akagi, Nagumo's flagship. Lieutenant Richard Best, calm and methodical, pushed his Dauntless into a near-vertical dive. Through the rising columns of smoke, he could see Akagi turning to port, her deck glimmering with bombers lined for takeoff. Best steadied his aim, released his bomb at 2,000 feet, and pulled up hard. The single bomb struck near the carrier's amidships elevator, piercing through to the hangar deck. It detonated among torpedoes being loaded onto Nakajima B-5Ns. The result was catastrophic. The Akagi's deck heaved upward, flame rolling from bow to stern. Nagumo's bridge shook. His officers, stunned and choking in smoke, realized that in mere minutes, the pride of Japan's carrier force had been mortally wounded. 3 Japanese carriers, Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were now burning, struck within the same 5-minute window. The timing, the precision, and the sheer audacity of Enterprise's air group had turned what was meant to be Japan's decisive victory into a disaster. Aboard the Enterprise, the radio room exploded in shouts and static. Messages from returning pilots came in bursts. Targets destroyed. Multiple fires. Returning to base low on fuel. On the bridge, Admiral Raymond Spruance stood beside Captain Murray, eyes fixed on the horizon. "Looks like we got them," Spruance said softly. Murray nodded, his hands trembling slightly. "Aye, sir. Looks like we did." But the celebration was brief. From the north, the surviving Japanese carrier Hiryu launched its own strike. Within hours, the sky darkened again with enemy bombers. Enterprise's radar picked them up first, small blips closing fast. The air defense alarms blared through the ship. Enemy planes inbound. "All hands to battle stations." Anti-aircraft crews manned their 5-inch guns and 40mm Bofors. The first enemy dive bombers screamed down from 12,000 feet, tracer fire chasing them through the smoke. Explosions shuddered the air. The deck crews ducked for cover as near misses sent water geysers surging skyward. "Hold your fire, wait for range," the gunnery officer shouted. Then as the planes dove closer, the carrier's entire flank erupted in flame and noise. Shell casings clattered across steel. One Aichi D-3A Val caught a burst mid-dive and exploded above the bow. Another released its bomb at 500 feet too late. It struck the water short of the hull, sending a column of spray across the deck. Enterprise took several near misses but remained intact. Hornet's group was hit harder. Yorktown suffered direct hits that crippled her engines. But Enterprise, battered yet alive, continued launching sorties one after another, relentlessly pounding the enemy. By nightfall, the Hiryu lay ablaze like her sisters. The once invincible Kido Butai, the Japanese carrier strike force that had dominated the Pacific, was shattered. 4 carriers gone in a single day. When the sun finally dipped beneath the horizon, Enterprise's flight deck was littered with the marks of battle, charred fuel stains, shell fragments, and the scorched outlines of planes that hadn't made it back. Crewmen moved among them quietly, collecting spent casings, folding torn flags, and marking down the names of the fallen. Below deck in the ready room, McCluskey sat exhausted, head in his hands. The men around him, pilots still trembling from combat, looked too stunned to speak. Then faintly over the ship's intercom came the voice of Admiral Spruance. "To all hands, the Japanese fleet is retreating. Today you have written a new chapter in naval history. Well done, Enterprise. Well done." For the first time in the war, the tide had turned, and the Japanese admirals who once mocked the American carriers, who laughed at the name Enterprise, now stared at maps of the Pacific with disbelief. Their fleet, their pride, their illusion of invincibility, had been burned away in a single afternoon by the ship they thought could never challenge them. June 5, 1942, the morning after Midway. The sea was eerily calm, the smoke of battle still clinging to the horizon like a wound that refused to close. The sun rose blood-red through a haze of burned oil. Around the USS Enterprise, the Pacific was littered with the floating wreckage of war, charred life jackets, twisted aircraft frames, fragments of driftwood blackened by fire. Enterprise's deck was alive again, though slower now. The men moved stiffly, their movements dulled by exhaustion. Pilots who had returned from the previous day's strike still bore the grime of combat. Faces blackened, eyes hollow but burning with the strange light that comes after surviving something impossible. On the bridge, Captain George D. Murray and Admiral Raymond Spruance studied reconnaissance reports. They knew the battle was not over. Somewhere beyond the smoke lay crippled Japanese ships limping east, and there was the constant threat of submarines and retaliatory airstrikes. "Sir," a signalman called out. "Message from Task Force 16, subcontact bearing 180. Spruance didn't look up. Maintain course. Launch patrol. We'll not give them an easy shot." As the day wore on, Enterprise continued launching scout planes, SBDs fitted with extra fuel tanks, fanning out in wide arcs. The ship's loudspeakers crackled with engine orders, catapult commands, and the rhythmic clatter of arresting wires. The smell of cordite and oil was now a permanent part of the air. Below deck, the damage control teams worked like ghosts. They patched holes from near misses, inspected fuel lines, replaced burst steam pipes. Chief Petty Officer John Ellison, an old salt from Kansas, ran his hand along the scorched steel of the hangar bulkhead and muttered, "She's taken worse. She'll take more." That afternoon, the sea exploded again. A Japanese submarine, I-168, lurking beneath the waves, found its mark. Not Enterprise, but her battered sister, USS Yorktown. The torpedoes struck true. Enterprise's crew watched helplessly as the distant shape of Yorktown, scarred, smoking, listing, finally slipped beneath the waves. Over the radio, they could hear fragments of transmissions, pilots calling in the sinking, voices fading into static. For Enterprise's men, the loss hit hard. The victory at Midway had come at a price, a brutal reminder that even triumph demanded blood. That night, under red battle lamps, the crew gathered on the flight deck. The chaplain read from his small sea-stained Bible, while the wind hissed softly over the open ocean. The names of the dead were read aloud. One by one, sailors removed their caps. For each name, a bell rang once. Then silence. Only the rhythmic heartbeat of the carrier's engines broke the stillness. After the ceremony, Spruant stood before his officers. "The Japanese will never recover from this blow," he said quietly. "But neither will we ever be the same. Remember what this ship has done, and what she still has to do." Indeed, Enterprise's war was far from over. Within weeks, she was at sea again, supporting operations around Guadalcanal, escorting convoys, hunting enemy submarines. The Japanese Navy, now wary and wounded, had begun referring to her by another name whispered in Tokyo's war rooms: the Gray Ghost. Everywhere she went, Enterprise seemed to appear when least expected. Japanese reconnaissance would report no American carriers in the area, until her planes suddenly screamed out of the clouds. Her very name carried an omen. In August 1942, off the Solomon Islands, Enterprise once again took center stage. She launched wave after wave of aircraft to support the Marines landing at Guadalcanal. The battle for the island became a test of endurance, not only for the men ashore but for the Big E herself. On August 24th, during the Battle of the Eastern Solomons, Enterprise came under direct attack by Japanese dive bombers. Sirens wailed across the decks. Gunners raced to their positions. The first bombs fell close, geysers rising against her hull. Then a second wave came, this time on target. A bomb tore through the aft elevator, detonating deep in the hangar deck. The explosion rocked the entire ship. Fire burst from the elevator shaft, swallowing nearby planes in a wall of orange and black. Metal shrieked, alarms blared, and men ran into the fire. Chief Ellison was among them. He led a hose team straight into the inferno, their boots slipping on burning fuel. "Get it out!" he shouted over the roar. The heat was unbearable. Ammunition began to cook off, small, sharp pops like snapping fingers. But they held the line. By sheer will and discipline, Enterprise's crew contained the blaze within 30 minutes. When the smoke cleared, 20 men were dead, dozens wounded, but the ship was still afloat, still moving, still fighting. The Japanese pilots who had attacked her returned to their carrier believing they'd sunk her. Radio Tokyo announced another victory, but 2 days later, Enterprise's aircraft struck back, her dive bombers hammering the same fleet that thought her gone. That night, a Japanese officer aboard the Shokaku stared at the burning wreckage of his comrades' ships and muttered, "This cannot be. That carrier should be dead." But the Gray Ghost was not dead. She would not die. Not at Midway. Not at Guadalcanal. Not anywhere the sun touched the Pacific. October 26th, 1942, the Santa Cruz Islands. The Pacific sky was a mottled gray, bruised with the promise of another storm. But for the men aboard the USS Enterprise, the real storm was already here. At dawn, the Big E launched her air group, Dauntless, dive bombers, Wildcat fighters, and Devastator torpedo planes, toward Japanese carrier forces that had once again pushed into the Solomon Islands. The Japanese fleet outnumbered the Americans nearly 2-1. Their aircraft circled like hawks above the clouds, and once again, Enterprise was at the center of it all. On the flight deck, gunners stood ready at their mounts, eyes fixed on the eastern sky. The air was thick with heat and tension. Then came the report over the ship's intercom. Enemy aircraft inbound. Bearing 120, range 40 miles. The sirens screamed, the klaxons bellowed across the ship. Every man on Enterprise knew the sound by heart. Battle stations. The first wave came low and fast. Val dive bombers shrieked down through the clouds, sunlight glinting off their wings. Enterprise's 5-inch guns roared in reply, tracers streaking upward. The first bombs splashed short, sending up towers of spray that drenched the deck crew. But the second run hit home. A 500-pound bomb smashed through the flight deck just forward of the island, detonating deep inside. The shock knocked men from their feet. The ship lurched as fires erupted below. Smoke poured from the elevator shafts. "Damage control to hangar deck!" shouted the loudspeakers. The carrier's heart was burning again. Down in the hangar bay, sailors fought the fire in choking black smoke, visibility reduced to inches. Hoses hissed, men shouted orders through gas masks, and flames licked across rows of armed planes. Ammunition cooked off like firecrackers. Yet somehow, through discipline and pure defiance, the fires were contained. Minutes later, another attack wave came. Enterprise's gunners, sweating, deaf, exhausted, kept firing. One Japanese Val plummeted, out of the sky trailing smoke and debris, crashing into the sea so close that its wreckage slammed against the hull. Another pilot, mortally wounded, steered his bomber straight into Enterprise's flight deck. The crash and ensuing explosion blew a crater 20 feet wide. For a brief, terrible moment, it seemed the Big E had finally met her end. Captain Osborne. Hardison, who had taken command from Murray, stood on the bridge, his face streaked with sweat and soot. "We'll stay afloat," he told the damage officer, "even if I have to hold her together with my bare hands." By sheer grit, the Enterprise's crew stabilized her. Pumps roared to life. Fires were contained. Flight operations, miraculously, resumed. Smoke still curled from the forward deck as her bombers launched yet another strike. From the sky, American pilots looked back and couldn't believe what they saw. Enterprise, her deck torn open, her island scarred black, still turning into the wind, still launching planes. When the battle ended that evening, Enterprise was the only operational U.S. carrier left in the Pacific. Hornet lay sunk. Yorktown was gone. Lexington, Wasp, and Saratoga had all been lost or crippled. And yet Enterprise, damaged beyond reason, steamed east under her own power, limping toward safety with her decks patched in steel and canvas. In Tokyo, the mood had changed entirely. The same admirals who had once mocked American carriers after Pearl Harbor now studied intelligence photos of the Enterprise in stunned silence. One of them, Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, who had perished months earlier aboard the sinking Hiryu, had once said before Midway, "The American carriers will die quickly as their battleships did." He had been wrong. The Enterprise had become the living proof of that mistake. By 1943, her legend spread across the Pacific. Marines on Guadalcanal would look skyward at the sight of friendly aircraft and shout, "The Big E's on station." Her very presence boosted morale wherever she went. Japanese pilots cursed her name. American sailors wore it like a talisman. Enterprise fought at the Gilberts, the Marshalls, the Marianas, and the Philippine Sea. She absorbed damage again and again, bombs, torpedoes, kamikazes, and each time she came back to fight. By war's end, she had earned 20 battle stars and the Presidential Unit Citation. She was the most decorated ship in the U.S. Navy. On May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, Enterprise was still at sea, launching sorties over Okinawa. A Japanese kamikaze struck her that day, exploding near her forward elevator. Once again, the ship caught fire. Once again, the crew saved her. They would not let their ship die before the war did. When she finally returned home in 1945, battered, but unbeaten, the sailors who had served aboard her lined her rails in silence as she entered Pearl Harbor. The same harbor she had missed on December 7, 1941, the day that began it all. Below decks, the ship's brass plaque had been polished bright again. It read simply, USS Enterprise, CV-6. We are the ship that fought the war. In the Ichionwar end, the Japanese admirals who once mocked the American carriers learned the hardest truth of all, that courage, discipline, and resolve could make steel immortal. And the Big E, scarred, unyielding, defiant, proved it, battle after battle until the very last day of the war.